A letter lands in a newsroom and it does not ask to be believed so much as performed. A voice calling itself a friend of hell promises that on a certain night at a certain time, anyone in New Orleans who lets jazz pour out of a window will be spared. And the city that invented late music suddenly turns every parlor and corner bar into a sanctuary made of trumpets and drums. So before we begin, tell me in the comments what your first instinct says about this case. Was there one Axeman moving through kitchens and back doors? Were there several men wearing a single myth-like a costume? Or did a burglar's pattern get promoted to legend by a clever letter and a terrified town? And then stay as we unwind how fear, sound, and routine braided themselves into the strangest safety plan in American crime. If you value method over myth, you're in the right place. Because we'll map what is known without indulging what cannot be. We'll keep every description respectful and non-graphic. And we'll leave you with one thread to pull that is more useful than any nickname or flourish in a headline. The pattern that would become a legend begins quietly and locally, with households that close for the night and expect to wake to the ordinary problems of groceries and school and rent, but instead wake to alarms and neighbors and officers peering at a door that should have been stronger, a panel that was chiseled, a wood shaving on a floor that looks like nothing until it looks like a map. The early victims do not live in mansions but in working-class rooms behind small stores, many of them Italian grocers whose lives are measured in ledgers and loaves, and in the mornings after, porches fill with faces that know each other, with the whispered question that every neighborhood asks when harm comes from the dark. Is the danger an outsider or someone we've already nodded to on the street? Police are not blind to patterns and they write with care because panic is a second crime. But behind careful words lives a private fear. If someone is choosing houses with the patience to remove a door panel and slip the lock from within, if tools at the scene belong to the house, if the weapon is what any family keeps in a shed for wooden chores, then method is the signature and not a particular object, and method is harder to chase. Here is our first pattern interrupt. The Axeman case feels singular in hindsight because history loves a headline. Yet at street level between 1918 and 1919, the city knows a broader truth, that break-ins were not rare, that violence attached to burglary was not rare, and that immigrant shopkeepers often lived steps from their counters because money does not stretch far when you are new in a place. So what makes this series into a story isn't only what was done, but how it was later described, and we will keep one foot in that gap for the next 15 minutes. Hold an open loop for later, the back doors. And remember that in many houses, the front is for customers and the rear is for family and deliveries, which means a person who steps through a kitchen has already learned something about the rhythm of a household that strangers do not learn by accident. The letter arrives in March of 1919, and it is many things at once: a taunt, a performance, a dare, and a practical problem for a police department that does not have the luxury of calling it fiction and moving on. Because if you print it and nothing happens, your city sleeps badly for a night, and if you hide it and something happens, your city never forgives you. So the newspapers do what newspapers do in a democracy, and the words land in 100 kitchens at breakfast like ash from a faraway fire. The promise is simple and theatrical. At 12:15 a.m. on a Tuesday, any home or venue playing jazz will be spared harm. What follows is a civic experiment unlike any in American crime. Dance halls sell out, phonographs turn, pianists who haven't played in months find their hands shaking new again, and a city uses music as a shield, not because anyone believes melody scares knives, but because shared noise can feel like the opposite of isolation. And isolation is where fear eats courage. That night passes without a fresh headline, and the letter that was supposed to frighten has also, somehow, reminded New Orleans of what it does best: turn a threat into a rhythm, turn private rooms into public company, and make strangers less alone for a few hours. An investigator with a tired pencil still has to work the mornings, and the mornings are full of the same persistent questions. Were these attacks the work of one man whose hours and access lined up with particular blocks? Did rivals or extortionists focused on immigrant shopkeepers borrow and then exaggerate a single signature for pressure and profit? Or did a reporter's flourish, an editor's framing, and a city's appetite for stories polish a handful of similar crimes into the Axeman we repeat today? Suspect lanes branch quickly. One lane looks for a familiar burglar, perhaps someone employed in trades where tools and quiet entry are ordinary. perhaps a man who passed unnoticed among deliveries and learned which doors were patched and which were tired. Another lane tries to tie the violence to organized pressure on grocers, the old story of men who sell protection and collect in fear, a theory that demands specific names and times that investigators could never nail to the wall with the confidence a court requires. A third lane whispers that copycats ride any headline with a rhythm, because once a city has a name for fear, other men with ordinary crimes find it convenient to borrow a mask. Notice that none of these lanes require a mastermind, which is the uncomfortable truth grown-ups know about many cases. Real danger often rides on competence and opportunity rather than on genius. Let's pause for a human beat, because numbers and dates can make a city sound like a chessboard. Picture a small back room where a mother stacks coins after closing, a father checks a ledger, a child dozes by a warm stove because the day was long, and in that glow the thickness of a door panel and the length of a latch become life or a headline. When we talk about patterns and tools, we are also talking about this room, this stove, this ledger, and the families who learned to sleep lightly. If that line put a picture in your chest, it's on purpose. Crime is not a puzzle first. It is a family problem writ large. We promise to come back to back doors, because they are the most ordinary and the most revealing part of this file. A front door is public and well kept because customers see it. A rear door is private and practical and sometimes patched. And a person who chooses the kitchen way says something about how he knows a household and how he wants to be known afterward, which is not at all. Add to that the pattern of weapons borrowed from the home rather than carried in, and you have a method that depends on speed, surprise, and exits. The city can't triangulate later. Technology is not the investigator's friend in 1919 because fingerprints are young science. Blood typing is limited, lighting is bad, and neighbors wake to confusion rather than witness statements that can stand at trial. So the file grows heavy with suspicion and light on proof. You will always find a cousin who hated a cousin, a rival who envied a rival, and a drifter who matches a hat and a stride if your description is slender enough, which is why responsible detectives bite their tongues before they say a name out loud. The letter's bravado complicates everything, because a city that has sung to survive now wants a single villain to hate, and names begin to circulate that feel like stories more than like evidence, the worst possible moment to be either loud or certain. Here's another pattern interrupt you won't often hear. The Axeman case is also a media case, a study in how newspapers frame fear, because when a writer chooses a moniker that fits on a headline and a letter arrives with theater baked in, you don't just inform, you compose. And composition can amplify or calm. That is not blame. It is a caution we carry into every era, including ours. And here's an open loop that deserves you. Were those grocery-adjacent targets coincidence born from where families could afford to sleep? Or was someone deliberately stalking a community whose language and hours were different enough from the city's majority to make them quieter, less likely to be believed, easier to frighten? A century later, the hard truth is, we can argue both ways without lying. Mid-video check. Tell me in the comments which lane you think carries the most weight so far. A single offender with quiet competence, a cluster of crimes pressed together by headlines, or opportunists riding a scary brand. And tell me which detail moved you. The kitchen doors, the borrowed tools, or the jazz night that passed without harm. Your answers will shape which files we open in part 2. If this is giving you something real to hold, share it with the friend who loves method over myth, because on this channel we deal in clarity, not campfire smoke. Back to the file, because files, not flourishes, pull cases forward. Investigators interview night workers, carpenters, men with chisels in their pockets and reasons to be in alleys. And they check pawn slips, hospital ledgers, and patrol notes for men who show up with cuts they can't explain after nights when households wake wrong. The yield is frustration, because a city that runs on deliveries and repairs produces 1,000 men who could be in the wrong block at the wrong hour with the right tool for innocent reasons. Now fold in the copycat problem. One loud crime invites a quiet crowd, and every time a household wakes to a rear door pride and a family harmed, the city's tongue produces the same name, Axeman, because named fear is easier to file away than untidy reality, and suddenly crimes that would once have lived as singular tragedies become part of a chorus investigators cannot tune by ear. You can feel the police department's fatigue in the way late reports read, careful, cautious, reluctant to promise closure. and you can feel a community's fatigue in the way families begin to upgrade locks, stack wood against doors, startle at the knock of a friend. One more human beat respectfully. Imagine the jazz night from a kitchen, not a club. A father sets a record down with hands that do not quite stop shaking. A mother smiles at a child because courage is contagious and fear is too. Neighbors sit on stoops and call across narrow streets. The horn at the corner bar plays like a siren that invites rather than warns. And for a handful of hours, a city that had felt like a maze full of shadows becomes a living room that stretches for miles. No historian has ever measured how many hearts learned to beat in time again that night. But you know the number is not zero. That is the strangest gift of this case. A threat produced a concert. And if you want an example of how communities neutralize performance-based fear, you can do worse than remembering what New Orleans did. Share, show up, refuse isolation. Now the suspects that historians still debate, handled carefully because names are not costumes. One lane fixates on a habitual offender whose movements match the map and who disappears with suspicious convenience when the heat rises. Yet paper is thin, where proof needs to be thick. Another lane holds onto the idea of extortionists focused on immigrant grocers and tries to map threats to outcomes. But the map has holes that honest people do not fill with hope. A third lane prefers a persona shaped by the letter rather than a person shaped by evidence, a mistake grown-ups do not make twice. In each lane, the same problem defeats certainty. Too many similar crimes, too little preserved physical evidence, and a city louder than its lab. Gather the case cleanly, the way we promised. A burst of night entries through kitchen doors where families slept steps from their livelihood. A practical method that used household tools. A set of neighborhoods tied by work and language, and the long hours of small businesses. A letter that turned fear into music for one strange night. A police file heavy with suspicion and light on proof. A city that learned to lock from the back forward, and a legend that drifted out of the facts like steam off a street after rain. What survives a century later is not a solved case but a practiced caution. Quiet patterns kill more than flamboyant geniuses do. Community is a better alarm than any one lock, and performance is oxygen for offenders who want an audience. So the best thing a city can do is remove applause without removing vigilance. Here's the practical threat I promised at the start, and it will not glamour anyone. When a pattern touches back doors, routines, and tools on premises, the most valuable question for any household isn't, who is the monster? It's, what are our habits? Vary closing tasks by day. Double-check the door you least show to customers, and trade a little convenience for a lot of certainty. Because in every era, boring procedures defeat theatrical crime. And here is the parting CTA. Tell me if your first theory lived or died by the end. Single offender, cluster shaped by headlines, or both. And tell me which detail changed you most. The kitchen doors, the borrowed tools, the jazz night that passed without harm, or the faces in small rooms who learned to sleep lightly. Your answers will decide whether part 2 pulls on suspect lanes or on the media machinery that turned a man into a mask. If this gave you something real to hold, share it with the friend who loves maps more than myths, and subscribe to Caseboard Daily, where we balance hook with honesty and let the quiet details do the loudest work. Remember the rule of this file. Sometimes the scariest part of a case is not a letter from a phantom. It is a back door you haven't checked in a week, and the music we make together is still the best way to keep a city awake.